guys, it feels like it's been a while since I filmed like a proper video. I don't know why, I've been feeling very distant, and I tweeted about it and I put it on Instagram that I was feeling distant from YouTube lately and just kind of uninspired, especially with everything going on, which I'm not going to talk about, but you know, it's just frustrating sometimes and very discouraging. So I was feeling a little bit, you know, distant from it, but obviously I love it, and I realized some of the passion that I had wasn't there, so I wanted to re-spark that in 2018. I can barely hear with this beanie on. Like, I feel like I'm yelling because I can't hear myself. Anyway, I feel like 2018 is going to be a very good year for my channel. I have a lot of ideas now thanks to you guys. You guys are amazing at recommending things because Monkey, what are you doing? When I ask for advice, usually it's like more videos about psychology, more videos about serial killers, etc. But it's hard to come up with specific things that I haven't already covered or that hasn't been done in general. Today we're going to be talking about serial killers that inspired movies / TV shows. The first person we're going to be talking about today is the Axeman of New Orleans. He is portrayed in American Horror Story Coven, which I did review that whole series over on my horror channel. A lot of these movies I'm talking about today I actually reviewed on my horror channel. If you didn't know, I have that. You can go check it out. They're very old videos, so just, you know, fair warning, they're not as good. But if you're interested, I will link them as I talk about them. He was the guy that like had a romance with Fiona. He actually in reality killed 6 people and injured 12 others, and this took place between May of 1918 and October of 1919. So it was a little bit less than a year he had that many victims, and his identity was never figured out and he was never caught. What's weird about him and his killings is that he seemed to target grocers and, you know, people who worked at grocery stores. I don't know if that was a coincidence that some of his victims, you know, all worked at a grocery store or owned grocery stores. And he also seemed to target Italian immigrants or Italian Americans. And it seemed, when they were questioning his motivation, it seemed like he most likely was going to these homes to kill the women, that it could have been some kind of sexual thing to kill the women, but he would kill the man in the household if he got in the way of killing the woman. The motivations were still questioned, even though there, you know, that was kind of an explanation, but they were just assuming in that situation. But also because he never took anything from the homes. He just went there to kill the people living there. His weapon of choice was, of course, an axe and sometimes a straight razor, which we do see in American Horror Story. So the Axeman wrote a letter that was published in a newspaper, and he had said that he was going to kill again 15 minutes after midnight on March 19th, which is my birthday. But he would spare anyone who was at a place where a jazz band was playing. Now that's something that was kind of portrayed differently in the show, but he did not kill anyone that night. There were people, you know, out staying out late where the jazz bands were playing to avoid being murdered. But no one died that night, and I don't believe he killed again after that. He kind of disappeared just as fast as he showed up. In the show, they portrayed that if you played jazz music loudly in your home, then he would not attack you, but it said specifically online you have to be somewhere where jazz band is playing, and I think that has to do with the time frame, honestly, that where it took place. Anyway, I'll put up his entire letter here if you want to pause the video and read it. It's very weird, very disturbing. He seems to imply that he's not actually a human and he's more of a dark spirit or a ghost, which is accurate to the portrayal of him in American Horror Story. Obviously he was a human, or at least I believe he's a human because I don't believe in, you know, supernatural things, but to me it's obvious he was, you know, a human killing people, and he was just, you know, claiming that he was like a dark spirit, or he was very connected with the dark spirit or something. The dark angel, I think, is what he said. But in American Horror Story he was portrayed as someone who wasn't all the way human, but there were reasons behind that I'm not going to get into because it might spoil the show for you, and if you haven't seen Coven yet, I don't want to spoil that for you. But do watch the show if you are interested more in the Axeman of New Orleans. The next serial killer we're going to be talking about is John Bunting, and he's portrayed in the Snowtown Murders, which is a movie, I believe it's still on Netflix, and it's an Australian film. I did review it on my horror channel over here. It is very, very disturbing, so do be warned if you choose to watch the movie. There are, you know, trigger warnings of sexual assault and obviously gore, murder, torture, things like that. So do be warned if you decide to watch that movie. So there were 12 victims total of the Snowtown murders, and they took place between August of 1992 through May of 1999 in South Australia. These are also called bodies in the barrels murders. There were actually other people involved in these murders. It wasn't just John Bunting. His friend Robert Wagner and James Velasquez also committed some of the murders or were accomplices to the murders, and then Mark Hayden was convicted as well because he helped dispose of some of the bodies. So John Bunting was known to be a charming man. He was very nice. He liked to help people out in the neighborhood, and James Velasquez, one of the accomplices, described him as polite and well-mannered. But of course, he had a dark side. He enjoyed torturing and killing people, people he thought was a waste to society. He liked looking into their eyes as they died to pinpoint the moment of their death. So as far as motives go, it seemed that he targeted pedophiles and homosexual men, but the real motive, it seemed, was just enjoyment. The movie reception was actually pretty divided, but it did win a few awards. The actor who actually played John Bunting in the movie said that he was really normal. He fixed your car, he made you dinner, he looked after your kids. Isn't it unnerving? And the director said that he found the ordinariness and banality the most horrific part of the story. To me, the movie setting and the acting did make it feel so real because it wasn't overproduced or over the top. It was pretty mundane. It was day-to-day life. You saw these people just living out in, kind of a rural area. And I feel like that's a very accurate portrayal to how a lot of serial killers are in real life. Not all of them are severely mentally unstable or over the top or obvious. The next killer we're going to be talking about is Ivan Milat. I'm not really sure how you pronounce his last name, I'm sorry. He is portrayed in the movie Wolf Creek, which is another Australian movie. Again, I will link my review up here. So his murders were known as the Backpacker Murders and took place in New South Wales, Australia in between 1989 and 1993. He had 7 victims total and were usually assaulted before being brutally murdered. And his primary weapons of choice were guns and knives. I'm not going to go into all the detail of what he did to his victims because it's highly disturbing, but if you are interested, you can always research it yourself. It is very graphic and horrible. He usually kept souvenirs from his victims, such as sleeping bags, tents. He kept foreign money because a lot of his victims were actually from other countries. He was sentenced to 7 life terms in prison, and he's still there to this day, as his last appeal in 2005 was denied, which actually 2005 is the year that Wolf Creek, the movie, came out. The movie is definitely more of a Hollywood-style film. It's fiction. It's not necessarily accurate to the killings of the real story. It's still extremely brutal, so, watch with caution if you're sensitive to that kind of stuff, but it is kind of a typical serial killer horror movie in a way. The movie was actually written by the director in 1997, and it was written as more of a traditional serial killer type film, but when the story of Ivan came out and the murders, he actually rewrote it to make the killer more charming and more likable. He wrote it to be more of a guy who just wants to help out these travelers and then becomes a murderer. Like I said, this movie is not that accurate to the story of the murders, of the real murders. It is just inspired by Ivan and his killings. Let's talk about a woman, shall we? A woman serial killer. This one is no stranger, I'm sure, to you. You guys will definitely know the last 2 killers I'm going to talk about in this video. Aileen Wuornos. She's obviously portrayed in the movie Monster, but she's also portrayed in American Horror Story Hotel. Aileen's story is very dark and very sad. I'm sure you guys know a lot about her if you watch a lot of these kind of true crime serial killer videos. I'm sure you've seen or come across videos about her on YouTube, but I will go into a little bit of backstory. Her crimes were that she murdered 7 men in Florida by shooting them between 1989 and 1990, so lots of victims within a year, and she died by lethal injection in 2002. Her first victim is actually kind of controversial because she claims that she killed him in self-defense as he was trying to sexually assault her. And one thing that was left out of her case is that he was actually in prison for 10 years for a previous sexual assault case, not even related to her. So the evidence was against him, however, she was still convicted for that murder, which she, deserved her conviction because she did kill a lot of other people, but I thought that was kind of controversial because it probably was self-defense, but she was still charged with it. So a little bit about her childhood and her backstory, because I feel like it's very relevant and very interesting and very heartbreaking. She was sexually assaulted as a child, and her father was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She never met her dad. Her mother had her at the age of 15 and abandoned her and her younger brother at her grandparents' house, so her mother's father's house. They legally adopted them, however the grandfather had then abused her there and allowed his friends to abuse her as well, and she ended up getting pregnant at a very young age, and they put the child up for adoption. After she was thrown out of that house at the age of 15, she had to support herself on the streets. She became a prostitute and lived in the woods that was near her old house. So as far as mental illnesses go, she was diagnosed with antisocial and borderline personality disorder. But I really just want to point out that although that is relevant in this case and one of the reasons why, it is not always the cause, and very few people who are diagnosed with these mental illnesses ever become violent. So don't ever associate just because a serial killer has that mental illness means that every person who has that mental illness is also a killer or also violent, because that's not the case. Most people who are diagnosed with these never become physically violent or hurt anyone, so I just want to point that out because obviously it's relevant to talk about mental illnesses in relation to serial killers, but also make sure you have that distinction between serial killers who are the extreme case and the majority of people who have that mental illness. Aileen was actually too mentally unstable to really fully understand her death sentence, and her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all." The movie Monster is a biographical crime film, so it is really accurate, or I would say pretty accurate to her actual life and her actual crimes that she committed. Obviously there is probably some fluff in there because it is, you know, a Hollywood kind of film, but it was meant to accurately portray her life as a serial killer. The last one we're going to talk about, I could not do this video without discussing him because he is one of the most famous serial killers and who has inspired probably the most amount of films, and that is Ed Gein. Some say I pronounced that wrong, Ed Gein. So he's roughly portrayed in a lot of things. I say roughly because not a lot of people, I mean there are like biographical things and documentary style films that were made from him, but the ones he's most famous for being portrayed in are definitely more of a rough portrayal, such as Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and recently American Horror Story Asylum. He was also known as the Butcher of Plainfield, which is in Wisconsin, where his murders took place. What's interesting to me is he's probably one of the most famous serial killers, but he has the least amount of victims in this video, of the killers I'm talking about in this video, and probably of a lot of other killers as well. He only had 2 victims by the names of Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, but he was also a known body snatcher, and he would take bodies from graves and collect and, you know, create little trophies of their bones and skin. He was found unfit to stand trial and was deemed legally insane, and he actually never spent that much time in prison, or if at all. He spent all of his life pretty much after the murders in psychiatric institutions until he died of respiratory failure in 1984, and he was actually buried in his hometown near his family plot in an unmarked grave. He's portrayed in so many movies, books, TV shows, and like I said, it's more of a rough portrayal, honestly, because they take certain parts, especially the skin part, which there are famous lines, you know, the guy in Silence of the Lambs who's obsessed with the skin, you know, American Horror Story Asylum where he makes lamps out of, you know, women's skin. Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre wears the skin, so that seems to be a focal point of a lot of people, which I think is interesting because their skin, I mean, he did use the skin of his 2 victims, but mostly they were skin found from dead bodies that he had not killed from a cemetery. But that's mostly what they utilize when creating something that's inspired by Ed. So those are all the serial killers that inspired movies I'm going to be talking about today. I could definitely do a part 2 to this if you want, or I could just continue doing different kinds of serial killer style videos. Let me know specifically what you want down below. You guys have been giving me so many good ideas, so I want to keep that going. If you have any specific requests, please leave that down below. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.